to T2RL Talks. With the excitement of the conference season now behind us, we've had time to draw breath a little bit and look at the current state of the industry. And T2RL has just published its quarterly update on the transition towards OOSD, Offer, Order, Settle, Deliver. And to talk about that and generally what's going on in the world right now, I have three guests in the studio. I have Bert Craven, the head of our technology practice and deputy CEO at T2RL, Ian Luck, the head of our distribution practice, and joining us for the first time on a podcast is our fairly new head of research, Amanda Campbell, who actually drafted the report that we're going to be talking around. And I'm sure Amanda will add some sense to the otherwise interesting ramblings of the three of us. So
yes, welcome, Amanda.
Thank you.
So essentially, one thing that I took out of the conference season, and I don't think it's a big surprise, is that the industry is definitely started on a transition towards what IATA calls modern airline retailing and we call OOSD. Whereas maybe a year ago, there was still a question of, is this really going to happen? I don't think that question exists anymore. Would you agree, Bert?
Yes, I think so. There certainly seems to be enough momentum now in terms of implementations that we're seeing going on and contracts that are being signed and RFPs that are being run or being prepared to be launched. So I would say we are well and truly into the swing of things now.
Okay, and the sort of distribution angles, Ian, it's sometimes a little sobering to realize that NDC was first announced 13 years ago. And for a long time, it seemed to be the ultimate slow burn. But I think we are now seeing a lot of airlines embracing the new distribution technologies and committing to it.
Yes, I think that's right. We're seeing more and more airlines launch NDC one way or the other. Some agreements, more agreements with Excelia, with Amadeus, some Sabre ones recently, more GDS NDC agreements, and we hear from Amadeus saying they have quite a few airlines now that are sort of 30% of their distribution is shifted, quite a few in the teens. There's definitely a lot more momentum, and most of the airlines we're talking to now, they haven't got NDC already. It's in their roadmap. Sometimes because they're interested in distribution change. A lot of them because they're thinking about OOSD and they're thinking about how do they get continuous pricing to market, and they're thinking sort of longer term.
Yeah,
you need NDC as the first building block.
I think that's certainly the case as far as I've observed it. NDC, when it was just an API for distribution, got some interest. It was gaining a little momentum, but now that people are really thinking through the changes to the way they want to present their offers to customers and to the market in general, it's really seen as a precursor to the full move to modern retailing.
Yeah, and there are definitely some airlines who almost the only reason they're doing NDC is because of particularly continuous pricing. They're launching continuous pricing. They're going to put that in their website. They want to get that out to the indirect channel, and NDC is the way to do it. Then they're not necessarily thinking about NDC as a big distribution disruption as some of the earlier airlines were. There's still both out there, but there's definitely some people who are quite focused on content and pricing and so on.
Yeah, and picking up on something that you did say there, the GDSs are signing up significant numbers of contracts now. Amanda, when we were putting the report together, I think I remember that at least 90 airlines now have got NDC agreements with one or more GDSs.
Yes, there's been significant uptake, all right, Ian, and I think we're seeing more and more news and announcements around that topic every month. So it's certainly an area to watch.
Okay. One of the big selling points for OOSD is that the OOSD systems or suites of systems will be by necessity more modular than PSSs have historically been. It was a big theme at our Engage conference in September, and it was, if anything, an even bigger theme at the IATA World Passenger Symposium earlier this month. On the other hand, most of the big announcements we've seen so far have been from airlines that are planning to take the whole kit and caboodle from one vendor, people like Finnair and British Airways, Saudi Air, Virgin Australia, and so on. Bert, do you think this aspiration for modularity is going to be fulfilled?
I think if airlines have a modularity aspiration, then the opportunity is probably greater now than it has been historically. Not all airlines do. I mean, it's a, this argument about the diversity of the vendor portfolio and modularity and internal cost and risk of integrations and so on has been going on for years, long before OOSD. I think OOSD is providing some new opportunities, but it's also presenting some new challenges because, as poor as the integration opportunities were in the legacy stack, at least they were through standard, well-known interfaces and message formats. And some of those are missing going forward. I think the other issue is that we see a lot of announcements that say, Airline X has signed up with vendor Y and so on. It's not always clear how much of a commitment there is. I mean, the assumption is that it's to the whole stack. But that is not necessarily the case, and some of the elements in it may be optional.
Yeah,
so,
and I think that's definitely right. And we also see, at our conference the previous year, one of my former colleagues from BA was on stage with Amadeus, and they made a point of saying we have a contract that enables modularity. They didn't say necessarily that we're going to implement a solution immediately that has modularity, but they clearly are enabling themselves that even if they implemented most of the Amadeus stuff to start with, I don't have any inside knowledge on that, but that could be the plan. Yeah. That then over time, if there's bits of that where they see other vendors with good solutions, they can plug those in. And so I think even if you don't start with modularity, you might go from PSS to OOSD in the simplest way you can. Yeah. From your current vendor to your current vendor's new solutions, but keep the option to plug new things in over time.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think we also have to remember that a lot of these systems are modular anyway, because today they are an OOSD platform sitting over the top of an old res synchronizing orders and PNRs and so on. There aren't many people who are freestyling their OOSD quite yet, maybe one or two. So I think the modularity is appearing. It's a bit patchy at the moment, and it's not easy to perceive because of the way that the contracts are being announced. But there are also new types of modularity appearing. So we used to tend to think in component terms. I get component A from vendor 1 and I get component B from vendor 2. But actually now we've got things like I get component A from vendor 1, but the AI science that's executed within component A is either built internally or comes from another party, a boutique data science house or whatever. So there are actually new types of modularity appearing, where I'm buying the science from one vendor and I'm buying the transactions, i.e. executing that science from another. So yes, I have high hopes for modularity, but we're all feeling our way at the moment because it hasn't been standardized.
And there definitely are some real examples out there, as you said, Ian. At WPS there was a few examples. We had Inc. in Innovation on stage with their delivery solutions, and that's they only do delivery, so they're anywhere they're implementing, they're almost by definition in a modular world.
Yeah,
there are others like that.
I think Bert said something important a moment ago, which is that in my mind, I have absolutely no doubt that the big vendors are building their systems in an architecturally modular manner. But will their contracts facilitate airlines being able to actually make use of that modularity and mix and match best of breed, or will it be made contractually very difficult to break the core vendor's product?
And without wishing to blow any trumpets, the answer is if they get a T2RL contract, yes. because we have a huge emphasis on the ability to do that. Even if you decide to buy everything from one vendor all at once at the beginning, the long-term protection of your right to have a commercially agile architecture, and swap components in and out and integrate new components, both at a component level and bring in third-party science and all that kind of thing, is something that we put a lot of time and effort into in constructing our new contracts.
I think in the report as well, I mean, just dipping into some of the detail, I think Riyadh Air's sort of go live is really a point in case, or a shining light in terms of modularity. I mean, clearly Flyer being behind the offer order management was a huge significant move, but we certainly have a few vendors in the mix supporting that major deployment. We've got Ink for delivery, we've got TP Connects and Vertel for NDC aggregation, Cellpoint for payments, Loyalty Juggernaut Loyalty. I think
Labor's involved in that as well. Yeah,
that's right.
Up the road, really.
Yeah, and I think Raghu put up quite a good slide at our conference showing quite a good mix of vendors in there in terms of what they've been implementing. So the answer is yes, you can absolutely do it, but the challenges, there are some new challenges, and there are some of the old familiar ones as well.
Yeah, one of the challenges that I guess has been with us since systems first started to be deployed, but is especially acute now that we've got this modularity goal, is the need for standards about how the different modules are going to fit together. And something that worried me quite a lot at WPS was when IATA said they don't expect to have a full set of standards until 2028. That seems to me to be far too late. And if the industry, as represented by IATA, doesn't come up with standards on a much more rapid timescale than that, then the dominant vendors are going to set the standards, and that'll be the end of it.
Yeah, but I think that's always been the case to some degree. It's very difficult to pre-write every single standard and hope that vendors adopt them, because it's very difficult for organizations like IATA to move faster than the vendor community. And I think that the IATA date is probably just an acknowledgement that some of these standards are going to come from practical real-world implementations that have been worked out between vendors and their customers. Now that's not neat or tidy, and it's far from ideal, but I think it's just a reflection of reality. I think if we waited for a complete set of standards before we started implementing, we'd never get started at all. And I think it's more about understanding the risks and challenges that presents and working out how we can mitigate them, rather than sort of falling back on wishful thinking.
Yeah, and that's fair enough. But I must say, I'm hugely disappointed that as an industry we don't yet have a standard even for something as fundamental as how do you create an order from an offer. That standard does not exist.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, look, IATA have members, and those members, their priority of those members ought to be reflected in what IATA are doing. So either IATA are not meeting the priorities of their members, or the members haven't been clamoring for this standard to be established, or it hasn't been well communicated. It's difficult to know.
And they are in a difficult place. And I think we absolutely should acknowledge that. If we look back to, if you like, the last orgy of new technology that hit airline distribution, which was the launch of Edifact 35 years ago. At that time, most of the big airlines who were in the IATA working groups had extensive capabilities themselves. Since that time, many of them have outsourced most of their technology capabilities. And unless the vendor community is able and willing and allowed to step up into the standard setting arena, it's going to be more difficult than it should be.
Yeah, I think some of the vendors have got involved, haven't they? But it's a slightly different dynamic because they've got their own commercial interests and they don't vote in the same way. So it needs to be quite collaborative with airlines, IATA, vendors figuring out how to kind of make this work together, which is probably more complex.
It really is complex, and the last thing I would ever want to do is say, oh my God, these people are so slow or so stupid or whatever. It's not that at all. It is a complicated problem, and people are doing their best to solve it. But at the same time, I really wish we could be moving faster.
Yeah.
One thing that is moving fast, and again, it came up somewhat in our conference, and again, probably even a little more in the IATA WPS. I wasn't at the World Airline Festival, which I think you were, Bert, so maybe it was being discussed there as well, is the whole subject of AI. And the subject of AI goes way beyond just our industry, our little parochial concerns. It's driving the entirety of the stock market's gains in recent times, and vast amounts of money being poured into AI. We published a week or so ago a paper on just some thoughts about the approach of agentic AI to our industry. And I think the conclusion, in some would say typical consultant style, was it's probably too early to say what many of the results were going to be, but whatever they are, they need some thinking about.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And, it's more who's not talking about AI than who is talking about AI. I mean, it's every pub and corner shop seems to be a conversation going on about AI in some form. And, a lot of it now turning to, conversations about concern for the alleged AI bubble and so on. And there is a huge amount going on in the industry, particularly, I think, with a focus on agentic AI and what that might mean for some of the business models, what that might mean for shopping and booking activity, and so on. And to a degree, it is too early to say. But you can sort of speculate based on, this isn't the first time that new technology has been introduced into business models. And I think typically people tend to overestimate both the importance and the impact of the technology itself. NDC was a classic example where actually there's a lot more going on in the business side of NDC and the just the traditional distribution business than the technology in and of itself wasn't as revolutionary as people believed. And it's actually only now when we start changing how we offer and where we place offer and what we place and how we price and so on, that NDC is kind of coming into its own. And I would say that the parties today who have access to content and who have access to consumer channels, whether they're direct or indirect, are likely to be most successful with agentic AI. And that's largely because AI has become so massively commoditized and democratized. The AI vendors are more or less paying people to use their products at the moment. I read in a report recently that Microsoft is losing $20 per Copilot user. The idea that the AI technology in itself is going to be a differentiator, I don't think is true, because pretty much anyone can get access to it. And so actually the differentiator will be how smartly you implement it. And do you have A, the domain knowledge, B, access to the content, C, access to consumers, and a huge amount of consumer choice data on which to train and model agents, right? Which would suggest then if everyone has broadly the same access to technology, the people who are going to be successful are actually the people who've got access to the consumers, the content, the domain data, and so on. Those people are more likely to build a better agent. So I think some of the talk at the moment about traditional players being suddenly disintermediated by AI are really coming from people who overestimate the importance and significance of the technology over basic market logistics.
Yeah, one of the big questions about AI, whether it be agentic or generative or any other kind of label you want to slap on it, is what's it going to do to look-to-book ratios? And there are two arguments. One says loads of software agents running around the internet, kicking off searches is going to push look-to-book through the roof. The other is loads of really smart software agents formulating much better queries will actually help mitigate the rise in look-to-books.
Yeah.
Which side of that argument do you find yourself?
Both of them are true. I mean, we know that loads and loads of, let's call them software agents, do drive look-to-book because there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of automated bots, heuristic scripts,
that have been there for ages. Yes,
and they've been there forever. And every airline who runs a website is absolutely drowning in a fire hose of just polling and scraping. So we know that that is true. I think the question is, if all of the people who are scraping today move away from a kind of a basic heuristic script to an AI agent, does that push the volumes up or does it push the volumes down? A smart AI, in theory, ought to be able to get to the right offer for a given consumer faster than a kind of a robotic scraper. That would be my first point. I think the other point is that the whole industry today runs on caches, and cache invalidation, i.e. how long can I hold a piece of data for, is one of the great hard problems of computer science. So if there's one thing an AI could do really well, it's manage a really, really smart and efficient cache. So if caching becomes more efficient, that should cause requests to go down a bit. So I tend to think about what are the things that would cause it to go up and what are the things that would cause it to go down. I think there may be new people who start scraping, but either they'll be more efficient at it than the current players, in which case it will push the current players out and you just get a natural replacement, or they won't be more efficient than the current players and they won't end up with a viable business. So I think there's a sort of an argument that says there could be as many downward pressures on overall volume as upward here. And I think it's only if the move to AI changes consumer demand, it actually changes the way that consumers behave, that we might have really significant changes in. Because what we have to bear in mind is the majority of traffic on the internet today is not really driven by organic, real consumer demand. It's driven by bots populating caches, trying to anticipate consumer demand.
Yeah. So Amanda, when we were researching the latest OSD report, pretty much every vendor company that we looked at is incorporating AI into their products in some way. Would you agree with that? Can you think of anyone who isn't claiming AIs in their products?
Well, maybe I could if I tried, but certainly it was almost a ubiquitous topic. I think in this report, what was quite interesting, though, is that everyone seems to have a slightly different take. Whether they're like Excelia, maybe using AI to query the order database to find commercially beneficial insights, or whether it's being used for delivery. I think Innovation as well is incorporated AI into their delivery solution. Sabre, I think, is also doing a bit of work around pricing with AI. So I think the key message in the report is, yes, everyone's doing it, but everyone's doing it a bit differently.
Yeah, and I feel a bit sorry for these poor vendors because, most of them have probably only just finished ripping out the blockchain that they put in a couple of years ago, which was also going to revolutionize the industry. And now they've got to start slapping in some AI to keep up with the market. So.
Yeah, when you were talking about the potential for people overestimating the impact of AI, I was reminded, I think it's one of Arthur C. Clarke's laws of something or other that says that people overestimate the short-term impact of a new technology and tend to underestimate the long-term impact. And I suspect that's what we're going to see. In 5 years' time, people will be doing stuff with Gen AI and agentic AI that at the moment we are only beginning to imagine.
Yeah, possibly.
Okay, another subject from conference season, and I'm very glad that we picked up on this a year ago, because it's certainly becoming very true, is the growing importance of managing payments and settlements in the commercial environment. At our conference at Engage, we had a dedicated payments track, which threw up some very interesting presentations and discussions. IATA, of course, a couple of years ago, combined the World Passenger Symposium with their World Financial Symposium, and tended to kind of cross-fertilize between the two. But I think payment has gone from being very much an administrative part of the jigsaw to being a strategic part of the jigsaw, and I think we're getting a lot of people realizing that now and bringing it to the fore. Any thoughts on what we've seen over the last couple of months in the discussions of payment?
I think one of the things that's notable is historically there's been a huge amount of fragmentation within airlines on payment. So if you wanted to talk about payment strategy holistically, it was actually quite a difficult thing to do. So on the back end, all of the acquiring would be sort of a treasury function, and then there would be a sort of an IT bit which was dealing with the various payment processes and so on, and then there would be a sort of a commercial element to it and trying to extend customer reach, and so talking holistically would generally quite often involve having to have at least three different conversations. And I think what we've seen is more and more airlines bringing all of their payment accountability and responsibility and payment thinking together and looking at it much more holistically.
Often they're bringing it together with distribution as well.
Yes.
Where there are quite a lot of overlaps. We do increasingly see people who are VP of distribution and payment or something similar to that role.
Yeah. Was that not your job title at one time?
That was my job title at one time. I had to learn fast about payment. I knew a bit about distribution, but I had to learn fast about payment. But yes, it is definitely a theme. And also, as you do NDC and offer order, you need to take a bit more accountability for how payment works in the indirect channel as well, which has its own complexities. So that's perhaps one of the drivers why airlines are bringing them together. Definitely, I'd see more people with that job role, and also in the vendor space. I mean, we've seen Amadeus go quite heavily into payment over the last few years with Outpace, and there are definitely other players that are. Travel Fusion has a payment product.
Right.
So there are a lot of different players in the distribution space that are kind of linking into the payment space as well.
Yeah, and I think there's also, payments is not just credit card transactions. I mean, there's a whole load of complexity in settlements, and there are lots of other forms of payment. And settlement in the airline industry has always had this sort of extra, things like the BSP and different methods for netting off what organizations owe each other.
Yes.
And also, I think if the ambition for airlines to become retailers of a broader set of services, particularly third-party services, then issues of payment processing and settlement and so on are going to rear their head again. And if we haven't done the groundwork in advance in terms of payment processes, payment orchestration gateways, all that kind of thing, it's going to end up costing more to do that business than it would otherwise. And so I think there's certainly a lot of good groundwork and preparatory thinking being done, both by airlines and vendors, about how to enable the payment and settlement end of airlines' modern airline retailing ambitions. So if we say, look, I've got an ambition to be a modern airline retailer, well, then you need to be a modern transactor in terms of payments and settlement as well.
Yeah, and have good data and understand how the transactions are flowing and all those kind of things.
Yeah, I think your point about it not being just about payment cards is something that's been a reality in quite a few parts of the world for some time. I think about the mobile payments capabilities that have kind of leapfrogged in Africa, where some of the things that we know and love just never happened, and they've jumped straight to mobile payments. And the Latin American market, where payment by quotas has been a thing as long as I can remember, and what's happening in China with WePay and so on. I think perhaps the airline industry was a little slow to recognize some of this, and I think partly because the payment by card mechanism was so well established and frankly very efficient, that people were a little bit reluctant to embrace some of the new things. But I feel that's changing now. In fact, I feel that's changed.
Yeah, I think that the issue with alternative methods of payment is that while they're sort of nascent and maybe you're not seeing a lot of demand and it might only be 2% of your transactions, it's difficult to justify significant investment in alternative methods of payment. But I think what's happened is that, again, in other industries, all of these forms of payment, micro payments, micro credit, all sorts of things are driving consumer expectation of how they'll be able to pay for things. And so sooner or later, airlines are just sort of waking up and saying, first of all, I need to do this. And secondly, it's being made much, much easier just to plug and play.
Yes.
I think the sophistication of some of the payment platforms now mean that I can turn on additional currencies, additional forms of payment in different markets. Actually, I don't want to make it sound like it's literally the flick of a switch, but much more easily
much
than ever
than
before.
It was. Yeah, I mean, 10 years ago, when I first had some payment responsibility in BA, we looked at some other airlines that were doing interesting things. I remember KLM had quite a lot of forms of payment. There's some interesting, Ideal in the Netherlands is a strong platform in itself, and there are some others in some of those key European markets for them. They fly a lot of interesting markets, but it was quite complex at that time to implement new forms of payment, I think, compared to today. So there are some airlines that have been on this for a while, maybe depending on the region you're in and the country you're in and whether those markets are particularly exposed to this.
Yeah, and I think all airlines are probably exposed to one special local or regional form of payment that only exists in a certain market, whether it's installments in Latin America or other unusual, cash low or whatever. You get all of these. And I think the point is that the barriers to implementing these things are coming down. And so it's not the sort of massively daunting thing that it once was to implement a new form of payment.
Yeah, and I guess we are seeing more airlines go to market for things like payment orchestration and other payment systems. And it does feel like you should be looking at this if you're not.
Yeah, and that was the point I was going to make, is that over the last few years, we've actually seen the creation almost of a new category of service company, the payment platform, payment orchestrator, which really didn't exist a decade ago, and now is very important to a lot of airlines.
Yeah. I mean, airlines wrote their own as best they could. So many airlines that I've worked with over the last 10 years had this kind of weird octopus of code that was basically switching transactions through different channels and different pathways, mostly rule optimized in order to find the best transaction rate and so on. And these bits of code would start off as a fairly simple switch, maybe just spreading credit between a couple of PSPs and acquirers, and over time got more and more and more complicated, and now have been completely sort of productified into these really sophisticated platforms. But I think, to begin with, there were probably only a handful of airlines who were operating at that level of sophistication. And the vendors have had to do a huge amount of work educating the industry about what payment orchestration is and how it's different from just a gateway, for instance, that kind of thing. But I think that is now starting to land. And I think that's one of the things that stimulated so much interest in payments, and why we've now got a dedicated payments track at our conference, is that that people have started to listen to that talk and really looking for the opportunities there now.
Yeah, and I will just mention then, as you did, we have the dedicated payments track at Engage 2025, and we're just in the process of outlining the agenda and the plans for Engage 2026, and the dedicated payments track will definitely be back. We were quite pleased with the result. First time we ran it, we maybe made a few slips, but on the whole, it was a very valuable exercise, and we'll certainly be doing it again in 2026.
Yeah, and I mean, we have to discover what people want to hear and how they'd like to hear it presented and so on, just like everybody else. And it's never too late to give us feedback. We're always interested in hearing from people about what they would like to hear or see at our conference.
Absolutely.
There's such an important intersection with the whole change to OSD. I mean, there are lots of payment experts out in the world, but I think we're particularly interested in not just payment in its own right, but how it's going to kind of interact with the change that airlines are making to their sort of broader technology stack is sort of particularly relevant to us, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, moving on, and in the last few minutes, I just want to talk about one or two of the technology vendors who are doing interesting things in the move to OSD. I'm actually going to leave aside the two 800-pound gorillas, Amadeus and Sabre. I think they don't have any difficulty in getting their news out to the market. Let's talk a little bit about Excelia, who I know that Amanda, you know very well. They're doing a lot of stuff, and I think they are, apart from obviously building and selling products, they're also trying to move the industry along in facilitating the adoption and facilitating the ways that different members of the distribution chain can work together. And I think that came out at both our conference and at WPS.
Ian, one for you.
Yes, I mean we saw BCD join the Fast Track, I think it's called. GBT, Sabre, having players across Concur, having players across the chain, I think is generally, we would all probably say, is a good thing. And when you've got players of that kind of scale, hopefully we will see some kind of meaningful change. We know that corporate in particular has been the most challenging place to kind of get NDC working. So yeah, I think we're sort of hopeful and supportive of the objective.
Yep. Okay. Yeah. And then our friends, or one of our two sets of friends in Istanbul, Hit It. Whilst everybody was maybe looking in the other direction, Hit It quietly implemented an OSD solution for a substantial European airline. And the first anyone heard of it was when they said, we've already done 10 million bookings.
Yeah. Yeah, and entirely by design, I'm sure. I mean, they will have been in stealth mode. I mean, Pegasus were already certainly their largest airline customer on the old Crane platform.
Yep.
And so an obvious partner for them to develop an OSD solution with. And I think this will be a really interesting space to watch. How long will it take until the Oxygen platform is sort of self-sufficient and doesn't require Crane underneath it, as it were? I think there's always a question about, well, how finished is it? Does it have a new DCS, or is it still an old style of DCS?
Yeah. And to be fair, that is a question we ask about any of the new solutions, including those from the 800-pound gorillas.
Yeah.
The other set of friends in Istanbul I referred to is actually Turkish Airlines. Somewhat going against the grain of industry trends from the last couple of decades, really. Turkish has announced that it wants to become a technology vendor to other airlines, as well as
it's
Turkish
done it.
IT providing for the host airline. And of course, very many of today's technology providers started off that way. They started off as the IT function of a substantial
and
airline.
some still are. I mean, Lufthansa Systems is still, testament to airlines can do this if they need to. And I think also because Turkish has spent many years really investing in its own technology, they're one of the few carriers who still have their own in-house mainframe PSS in the form of Troya. But they also, innovate and build their own technology. And I'm sure there's enormous pressure to somehow monetize some of that investment as well. So Turkish technology has been born, and obviously we wish them all the best.
Yeah, and I had quite a long conversation with at WPS, and apparently they've got 100 people allocated to Turkish technology to start with. So
yeah,
it's certainly something they're taking seriously, and obviously there will be airlines who will be very interested to talk to them, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's always been a slightly sort of interesting conundrum around, would you buy technology from another airline? Would you buy technology from another airline who were your competitor? That kind of thing. But historically, as you said, Ian, it's been fairly common for airlines, either individually or as groups, to start technology.
Very much so. In the mid '90s, when I was at British Airways Speedwing and responsible for the multi-host res system we put out, we had both British Midland and Ryanair hosted in the platform, and we seem to rub along.
Yeah, absolutely.
And another company we've talked to recently was TIC Systems, who have also quietly developed an offers and orders based system and offering it to the market. In some ways, it's easier, I think, for those vendors who've largely worked with low cost airlines and airlines with simpler business models to make the transition, because they don't have quite as much legacy baggage that they've got to accommodate, and they're probably working with they're starting with a slightly younger generation of technology, even in their existing systems.
I think that's right. And I also think it shows that you don't have to be a sort of a massive behemoth of an organization, that actually, if you've got that domain knowledge and expertise, you can implement very good modular solutions quite quickly and efficiently. I mean, we were looking at some of TIC solutions, and they've got a very capable ticketing server, which will run as a completely standalone component, alongside PSSs that are ticketless. So I think that for people who understand how some of these legacy technologies work, actually implementing modern modular versions of them is relatively straightforward. And what the industry needs at the moment are these kind of glue and compatibility and translation layers. We've talked about how important transition is going to be over and above just the technology itself. And so I think solution providers who understand how to translate to and from modern and legacy standards and can quickly produce modular components, I think there's definitely room for those kinds of people in the market.
Yeah.
Well, when we were talking to those guys, I mean, clearly their experience and their knowledge and so forth really shone out. They were a really great team. But I also admired them for their sense of humor. I think they've named their platform OOPS, or Oops.
Yes.
Passenger Servicing. So fair play to them for having a wink as well as delivering great work.
Okay, we could probably carry on this conversation for a long time, because there is a lot happening in the industry and in the market at the moment, but we don't want to run on too much beyond people's typical drive to work, which is where I understand many people listen to this podcast. So I think we'll wrap it up for now. We will be back quite soon with another podcast where we're going to take a deeper dive into the market for distribution aggregation, NDC, and other forms of API that people are aggregating outside some of the traditional channels. And it's a very interesting market. We're also having a great deal of fun, or Amanda is trying to get together some credible numbers on that market, which are a little bit hard to come by, but we'll talk about that much more next time. For now, I will just thank the three guests in the studio. I'd like to thank Ian and Bert and especially Amanda, and welcome to T2RL Talks, Amanda. And I'd like to thank you for listening, and I look forward to talking to you again in the next edition of T2RL Talks.
Thanks, Ian.